Hey, this is Richard Rogers. I'm continuing my series on polling in the 2020 elections with this special video about the Georgia Senate runoff. And this is a really interesting election. This should have been an easy win for the Republicans, but what has happened is that it is turning into a toss-up. So we'll go over some of the numbers here in this presentation. First, some comments about my predictions for Congress. I didn't do as well with Congress. I didn't really understand the dynamics of the congressional races. I didn't put a lot of time into it either. With the House, we're stuck primarily with the generic congressional ballot numbers. And based on that and that alone, I assumed that the Democrats would retain control. That was correct. What I put in writing is what happened. The Democrats have retained control of the House of Representatives. However, I did not expect the kind of losses in their numbers that happened in November. In the Senate, I did not. Uh, I was not like some people thinking that the Democrats were going to get 52 or 53 seats. I was more conservative in my estimates, but I did err in Maine and North Carolina. There still is a chance that the Democrats could get 50 seats if they win both races in the Georgia runoff election. So that's what we'll be looking at here. But I'm going to say I didn't do well in the Senate either. So I feel like I did a good job with the presidential election, and that was the previous video in this series, but not so good in the Senate and the House. So let's look at what happened on November 3rd. And this is why I say the runoff should be an easy win for the Republicans. So there were two Senate races, the regular Senate race, which candidate was running for 6 years, and then the special election to fill a term. In the regular race, there were three major candidates. Uh, Purdue won the plurality of votes. However, it was not enough to win that election because in Georgia you have to have a majority in order to win that election. The natural proclivity would be for those libertarian voters at 2.3% libertarian for most of them to move over to the Republicans. So uh, Purdue actually only needs a small portion of that vote. So it looks like that's a slam dunk for Purdue. In the special election, there were a whole bunch of candidates on the ballot. And when I added together the numbers, the Republican and Democrat numbers, those are not votes for uh, Loeffler and for Warnock. Those are votes by party because there were multiple candidates for each party on the ballot. And you'll see that the Republicans had close to a majority, but not quite. But there are enough other votes out there that they only need to get a small number to go over the top. So that race might be a little bit tougher for them to win, but it's easier for them to win that than for Warnock to win it. So we would assume that in a Republican state like Georgia, that the majority of those other voters would switch over, and certainly the libertarian voters, most of them would switch over to the Republican candidate in the runoff, and so that should clinch it for Loeffler. Now let's take a look at what's actually happening in the pre-election polling for the runoff. The screenshot here is from Nate Silver's 538 website. You'll see as of New Year's Eve, he had Ossoff, the Democrat, with a 0.9% point lead, and he had Warnock in the special election with a 1.8% lead. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what we just should have been said. What we said should be happening, given what happened on November 3rd. Some of this could be poll fluctuations, and you do see how the red and blue lines cross, that there are significant fluctuations based on the poll of the day, but it's not really what we would expect. If I were to use the methodology that I used in November 2020 with the presidential election, I would say that Georgia is leaning Republican. However, that was a methodology built for Trump, and that methodology did not work in Georgia. Georgia was one of the states where I underestimated the response for the Democrats. And so I have to agree with what we're seeing here, that this is a really close race that is now a toss-up, at least as we see it in the polling. This leads us to look at two important questions. And the first question is, will the Republicans show up? Georgia is a state that historically has been Republican and that still leans Republican. We see that here. I took some of the recent polls and looked at the crosstabs where there was a lot of detail. And in two of the three recent polls, it is clear that the Republicans still have a plurality in Georgia. Independents in Georgia are kind of a small group. So we think of independents in the United States as running in the neighborhood of 30% of voters. You'll see that that's significantly less in Georgia. So it's between 10 and 20% based on these polls. Survey USA is a little bit of an outlier. It is finding a few more Democratic voters than Republican voters, but that's not a huge amount. And my guess is that that's a sampling error because nobody else is showing that kind of showing that kind of support for the Democrats in Georgia. Now, keep in mind what I have here. This is just your party identification, not how you're voting. So what we're saying is that there are more Republicans than Democrats in Georgia, or it looks that way, who are like to be likely voters, and so that's something that should be significant in boosting the Republican totals in Georgia. However, the Republicans have a problem. So we have all this talk about election fraud in the 2020 presidential election. There is no proof of massive fraud, nothing that would overturn the election. The one state where things were supposedly really out of control, which is the state of Pennsylvania, the issue affects only 10,000 votes, which would not be enough to overturn the results in Pennsylvania. Um, it's particularly intense in Georgia. Georgia now has counted its ballots two different ways for a total of three different counts of those votes. It has now done a signature audit in Cobb County. You're going to ask, well, why did they do a signature audit in Cobb County? And the reason was there was actually a legitimate complaint there, and they went there and they found no problems. So complaint after complaint, the vote is surviving in Georgia, yet we're hearing crazy things. And the QAnon people have been especially loud in Georgia through Lynn Wood, who is a lawyer. I'm assuming he's QAnon because he's spouting QAnon ideas. He may not formally embrace QAnon, but his message appeals to that group. And he's saying now all kinds of wild and crazy things, and is actually telling people not to vote, that they shouldn't vote for Republicans in the Senate runoff because the election's already rigged and we have to send a message to the Republican Party. Question is whether that message is resonating. There has been some anecdotal evidence of that. So when the Republican national leaders came to Georgia to encourage voting in the election, there was pushback from the audience. Frank Luntz, who is a Republican pollster and does a lot of focus groups, some of which you see covered on TV, he is saying that he's hearing this from Republicans in the focus groups. And one of the recent surveys has asked about this and looks specifically at is someone going to intentionally boycott this election because of what they're hearing? And it does indicate that there are a group of Republicans who are going to boycott the election, and this group is larger, twice as large among Republicans as it is among Democrats. So right away, when we're talking about these small leads that the Republicans need to, this small shift in voters that the Republicans need to get in order to win the runoff elections, we see that by buying into these election fraud cases, of which we want to repeat, there is no evidence of widespread election fraud in 2020, but by buying into these, Republicans are actually suppressing turnout in Georgia, or could be. The other issue here is what's going on with the independents. In order to answer this question, let's look at three different polls. So we'll start with Survey USA. The Survey USA poll, which is regarded as one of the better national pollsters. Now, I'm going to say I didn't find that in 2020. It was not one of my big battleground winners, but I'll go with the conventional wisdom for the moment to say that this is one of the better polls. This also is the poll, however, that yields that strange result that says that we have slightly more Democrats than Republicans voting in this election, and that's something that people think is out of character with Georgia. But look at what they have here in independents, and we're going to see this consistently in the polls, all three polls. This lead for independents in both Senate races for the Democrats. So here we have 53% of independents saying they're going to vote for Ossoff and 54% voting for Warnock. In the Survey USA poll, there are not enough undecideds. It's a big group of undecideds, but there's not enough to flip this category. Now, in this poll, a 10% lead among independents translates into an increase in 1% for that particular candidate. So we're saying these leads of almost 20% are going to result in almost a 2% swing in favor of the Democrats. That's the Survey USA version. Now let's go over to Reconnect Research. As you'll recall, the other two surveys show a plurality of Republicans voting in the upcoming election, or in this case, may have already voted as well. That's included in that number. You will notice, however, that we still have leads among for the Democratic candidates. What's different in Reconnect Research is the percent that's undecided. The general rule of thumb is when you see undecided voters, they are going to break for the non-incumbent. So we do need to think about Perdue and Loeffler as being quasi-incumbents in this election, and therefore the expectation would be that Ossoff and Warnock would get the break in the undecided voters. Now there is the possibility of another dynamic in play, and there is reason to believe that some Georgia voters are going to split their ticket in this election, that they don't want to have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and I'm sorry, they don't want to have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic President, and so they're going to vote for one or both of the Republican candidates in order to keep the trifecta from happening. But not many polls show that happening, but that could be accounting for this large undecided vote here in the Reconnect research. Insider Advantage, which is the other one that shows more Republicans turning out for this election than Democrats, does have the Democrats having a lead in both races, and a pretty large one at that. There are not enough undecideds in either race to swing the election. And for Ossoff, they have an Insider Advantage has a big lead for Ossoff in this election, even if we count the undecided switching. So let's go back and ask ourselves the initial question: how did a slam dunk become a toss-up? And there are two things happening in this election. Number one, the election conspiracy theories are taking root. It does appear that it's going to suppress some Republican turnout. Second, we see something happening in the independents in Georgia. Independents do seem to be swinging towards the Democratic candidates. Now, is this enough? Georgia, we think, is plurality Republican, so that should give the Republicans an advantage, and the Republican candidates don't need a small amount of votes to swing things in their favor if everybody votes the way they did in November. The question here is that the small changes related to each of these issues is enough to undermine the campaigns of the Republican candidates. So it's going to turn out to be a really interesting night on November 3rd. And I completely expect if the Democrats win one or both of those races, that we're going to have a whole bunch of uh, legislative committees and lawsuits for weeks to come because the Republicans are having a hard time believing that anyone in the United States would vote against them. So, but that's what is happening, and the transition that we saw in Georgia with the presidential election, that movement towards the Democrats, it does seem to be happening. And even if Democrats do not win either race in this runoff, the transformation of the electorate in Georgia in just a few short years has been dramatic. And in the long term, things are starting to really favor the Democrats there. So we'll see what happens here. That's all I have to say about Georgia. Thank you for spending time and watching this video, and hope to talk to you again soon. Bye.